Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Aronchick. I lead. Oh, something happened. I lead an open source project called Bacalhau. We are focused on compute over data. I previously had experience at all the major clouds. Worked at Google and Amazon and Microsoft. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the first PMs on Kubernetes. And so I have a lot of experience in this in a broader sense. One of the things that I really enjoyed in between Kubernetes and where we are now with my current project is I did a lot of work in ML. And I think it's really interesting to talk about, what the questions are around these platforms, what the questions are around data and identity and so on and so forth. And we're very, very lucky to have some real experts here to talk about this. Let me give each person an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right in.
You hold the microphone. Oh, now I am it. Hi, I'm Maartje. I actually have 3 jobs, but the one I'm here paid for today is I'm a software engineer, one of the founding software engineers of a UK-based startup called Cofight, and we're working on making workload identity in cloud native. It's very broad. My work is very broad, but it's a very interesting identity domain.
Hi, I'm Misell. I work at the Max Planck Institute for Informatics in Saarbrücken, Germany. The focus of my work is on internet architecture, so making the internet work better, hopefully for everyone.
Hi, I'm Jack Gilmore. In my day job, I work for the NHS up in Scotland on various different applications to support our health and social care workforce. But the more interesting reason as to why I'm here is I'm the co-founder of Open Data Scotland, where we help people in Scotland or around the world understand better and locate better data in Scotland.
Amazing. So we have a expert panel here who is all kind of looking at different, hands on the elephant around this. I think one of the most fundamental things that is wonderful to begin with, and we can start right here, is when you hear the term digital identity or data identity, what immediately pops to mind? How do we get started in this conversation?
X509.
So you're going straight to the certificates or GTFO?
Certificates, when we are talking about public-private key, crypto is the base of basically any digital identity, unless you still are a fan of all-based password-based authentication. This is all a basis. It's a very broad domain. We can apply this to anything. We can apply this from logging into your email. We can apply this how your computer knows it's talking to the right email server.
Yeah.
We can also apply it to the train ticket that is in that email. Everywhere in the world we are today, digital identity is encoded using cryptographic bases that have been around since the 70s. That's what I think when I hear digital identity.
Okay. So extending that, you talked about things like obviously that are machine representatives, service accounts and things like that, all the way up to real human beings. How do we think about rights and other things like that when it comes to where is the line between what an app has the right to ask for, between what a system or a machine has the right to hold on it on a long-term basis? Sorry. Oh, thank you so much. To hold on a long-term basis, like when something asks for too much, what do we do? How do we know what the norms are around these kind of questions?
Well, I think this is a problem that's coming up more and more these days. But the main issue I have around this kind of problem is that app developers, or maybe the people telling the app developers what to do, seem to have the idea that the opposite of yes please is ask me again later. And, it's not. And I think a lot of these apps are developed in the context of a US-centric culture on how data identity and data privacy should work. And I think we have laws in Europe about this. The UK still has the GDPR from when it was in the EU. And I think it should be clearer to people that you don't have a right to anyone's data.
Yeah.
You have to justify it.
Yeah.
You have to either justify it on a legal basis in that, no, we need this data to be able to provide the service,
Yeah.
or you have to be able to justify it to the person for them to willingly give it away to you.
Absolutely. I think you actually bring up a really interesting question, and you're the perfect person to answer because you're dealing with health data, right? And you're dealing with the idea, so exactly extending from what Q just mentioned, like how do you begin to think about, there's this, for Americans, when they come to the EU, it's a nightmare. Like you realize how bad the browsing experience is, right? Because you are just assaulted with cookie requests over and over again, which no one has ever read. I refuse to believe, like for large values of no one, like no one has ever read. So you're talking about something where it's like, now we begin to think about what is the longevity of permission around a digital identity, right? You are talking about someone, their entire life. They could be given permission when they are 3 years old. Does that system still have permission when they are 87? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess it's a question of who gives the consent and when, because obviously when you're looking at younger ages, there's going to be a parent or a guardian who's involved in consent then.
Right.
But then it's a question of, do you then get to review the consent of that data later on in life? Is it possible to withdraw that consent? Is it possible to take data back after it's already out there? This concept like if you ask a social media website, say for example, to delete your data, are they actually deleting it in the background, or are they simply switching a switch to say this is no longer visible publicly, but we're still going to process it in the background because you signed away your rights to that in that big terms and conditions document that you didn't actually bother to read.
Right.
So yeah, it's.
Extending that even further, I think it's we one thing that again we haven't even begun to touch on in most of these systems is the idea of not just the stickiness of the permission or what you gave as far as the data was concerned, but what happens to derivatives of that data, right? So when you think about training an ML model or training, just building a a linear regression on something, and your data contributed to that, do you have any thoughts on like, you're never going to unpack that, right? It's like you toss your whatever, coin in the ocean. You're never getting that coin back, right? The ocean's now, out there and it's got your coin forever. Do you have any thoughts as you go through your day job? Like, how do you think about unpacking who owns what and how to undo it?
I guess as a scientist, this is a question that comes up quite a lot. If we involve human participants in our research, we have to be very careful about what we're doing with that. And generally, an ethics review board is involved. And some might say that maybe you should have an ethics review board for certain ML projects as well. But if it's the problem comes when the regression or whatever training you're doing on this data makes it in such a way that you can reproduce this data again in future.
Yeah.
If you've used some personal data to create a model, but this model could never be used to get back to that personal data, then you're probably doing okay. You should probably delete all the personal data once you're done with it, but the output of it is generally not tied to any one person. But that you can go to any large language model chatbot and say, "Oh, give me a rendition of this," and then or like maybe it just happened to pick up someone's email address on their personal website, and then you can ask it, "What's this person's email address?" And they maybe actually didn't intend that to be on the internet, and that the inability to delete that is when it becomes problematic.
Right. So extending that even further, I think there's so again, for those that aren't U.S. citizens, or U.S. aware, the identifier of choice in the U.S. is the Social Security number, right? Which, for all intents and purposes, is immutable, right? Like, sure, there is the possibility of changing it, but it's such a terrible number, it is difficult to imagine. Like, it is fixed, it's all numeric, like easily guessable, easily predictable, and things like that. Perhaps, there's something to, instead of having an identity associated with a person, you have something that is revocable or is rotatable or something like that. Do you have any thoughts about, what might be a better way for us to represent people?
The reason that this is like, and almost every country in Europe also has an equivalent of the social security number, is to somehow track the history. Many European countries have EIDs. I own one. Estonia is famous on them. And they actually contain a public and a private key pair, which I can sign contracts with.
Okay.
It's an amazing system. It is revocable, even though the revocation system is just like all revocation systems, a little bit broken. The problem is the government needs to track the linking of that certificate to my social security number. And should that social security number change for any reasons, like leaking, the government still has to keep track of who I was before. The problem is, who do you give access to that social security number? There are very strict laws in the European Union around GDPR and who can carry this. Well, in the US, you can apparently just buy it on the dark web for €5.
Yeah.
We hopefully have laws around those numbers and who gets to track around them. The problem is, who do you want to give access to?
Yep.
I come from Belgium, and there was a time in Belgium before the GDPR where stores were like, hey, we have electronic identity cards. What if we use them as loyalty cards for our store? And people happily gave up their ID, which contained the social security number, the security number, the signing certificates, and a picture to a random cashier.
Wow.
That's what I ask questions at, like, well, who has access to that very personal data? And people from that experience, they don't care. And that's sad.
Going even further than that, I don't know. Is this the one case where a blockchain might actually be useful, or some public ledger where you have a? I'm the one saying there's no use. Don't boo me. Where it means that there isn't. That you can do public verification, you can do public roll forward, you can do, forward privacy and things of that sort. Is there a role for a non-governmental, non-institution-based identity system? And if so, how do we even bootstrap that thing into existence? I don't know. That's a big question. Do you have any thoughts on that? Jack?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not going to speak too much about blockchain, so you'll be really relieved to say that because I'm not qualified to speak upon that. We've heard already earlier on today about great projects out there like Solid that could potentially be adopted as a decentralized kind of manner of being able to manage your identity. And, I think that gives you a great potential of ways to kind of host your data, whether that's something that you want to trust yourself as to self-host, or whether you want to have it as in a cloud provider specifically. So that could potentially be a way to go about it.
Interesting. I guess the question then extends. Obviously, if you're self-hosting anything, you're already the 0.1 of the 0.1%, right? The question then becomes, let's look at the other end of the spectrum, right? I love my mom. There's zero chance she will ever even understand the concept of self-hosting, let alone choose to do that herself. For the non-digital native, how do we not have them feel like second-class citizens and still have all the things that a digital identity might unlock?
I guess, this is one of the problems with using blockchain or any really complicated solution to the problem, is that the average user has no idea about this. And it's not that they don't know, they also don't care.
Yeah.
They want to be able to instinctively trust that this is a secure system and that their data is being handled in the way that they want it to be. And you can't just go to the average citizens and say, just trust me. Like, the worst thing to hear from the government is trust me on this. I'm sure we all here in the room could look through the paper defining how this works and go, that seems like it's a relatively secure system. But then good luck explaining that to anyone else. The advantage of some of the systems that are deployed in Europe with the physical smart cards is It's quite obvious to a user when their data is being shared. Have they put their card into the reader?
Right.
And then they know, well, okay, I'm putting it into the reader at the bank. The bank has read my identity off of there. When it gets more complicated than that, people start, they don't, it's not clear to them what's actually going on.
Yeah. I think that it brings up a really interesting question, right? Like, as I mentioned earlier in the GDPR experience, right? It's in the cookies, not ideal. Even tapping, I had 2FA everything, right? Yet it still irritates the hell out of me when, the timeout expires on my 2FA and I'm like, oh, I gotta fill that stupid thing out again, right? And I know why they're doing it, right? To the line of code. Have you seen anything as a use case or a user scenario or something like that where it strikes the right balance of asking you permission but without being overly onerous? I don't know. I'm kind of curious.
You're talking about convenience versus security.
Exactly.
Have I ever seen convenience versus security done right? No.
Fair enough.
It's either, way too simple or way too complicated.
Yeah.
I like smart cards for a simple idea. You know when it's given. In a corporate environment, I would recommend to buy security keys like the Google Titan or the YubiKeys because they are striking a little bit of balance. You don't have to find the phone, grabble it, and these days they want you to also scan a QR code and then type the code. They just are like, plug this into your computer, press this. You have known you have given a cryptographic identity signed with like a passkey solution, FIDO standards. Your average user knows it, and you can explain it to your average employee within the company. This is your physical key. It's like an office key, except instead of turning it to open the office, you press this button to open your computer. However, applying this to the general public, it's a bit harder. I don't see the government handing out YubiKeys for doing taxes.
I mean, I don't know. There's got to be a way. Actually, let me ask Jack. Is it worth it? Right? Like, again, in the U.S., there's this big effort, like, mail-in is too convenient or whatever. We should get back to paper ballots and whatever. And from a security guy, there's actually real value in paper ballots, right? Like, they're really hard to hack. Is there a benefit for these things? Like, when you think digital identity, when you think, like, if we just had a digital identity, it would unlock foo that is good for the world, that balances all these trade-offs. Is there anything that's top of mind for you that you think about?
When I think of digital identity, I think of convenience, preferably with having as minimal amount of usernames and passwords that I have to store in my password manager as possible.
Yeah.
I was coming up with a list earlier of things, when I'm dealing with the government, and you're talking about national insurance numbers, passport numbers, driving license numbers, HMRC IDs, all these different logins, that I need to remember. And I do have a password manager, but then from time to time it's like, okay, what service am I engaging with here? It's not just a case of I am dealing with the government. I can have one login for this. So, I know there's progress that is being made on this. So, hopefully maybe one day we'll get towards like a single identity utopia, but it doesn't feel like we're anywhere kind of near it for now.
I don't want people giving up on the Q. Is there anything in particular that you've seen that makes you optimistic? Like, I know we all turn over and see every possible ugliness under the when you turn over the rock. Is there anything where you've used digital identity or been part of a system where digital identity really made you happy?
Yeah, so this is actually something I came across relatively recently. But in Switzerland, your ID card is now also a WebAuthn FIDO authenticator. So it's really easy for websites to just say, just tap this to log in.
Yeah.
And then it's a passkey. And I guess I'm not sure how well this is being used. I only just discovered this by accident, so I have no data on that, how well this is implemented, or do the Swiss people even like using this? But this seems like this seems like a clever solution to the problem of everyone already has one of these.
Yeah.
We'll just add a well-known standard to it that everyone's phone can already talk with and every website can already talk with.
Yeah.
And we know WebAuthn is secure, and users are already kind of getting used to it, with Apple especially very heavily pushing their passkeys system, which I think Apple have done a pretty good job on that one. The UI is maybe in need of some improvement, but it's a lot better than some UIs I've seen for dealing with digital identity. But, you know, then you're stuck in Apple's walled garden. And maybe one could say, if you use the Swiss system, you're then stuck in Switzerland's walled garden. But generally, a governmental walled garden is slightly more accountable than a corporate walled garden.
Absolutely. I do want to make sure that we have enough time for questions, so I'll just ask one more, but of the entire panel. You all are here, you're all experts in your field. I'd love to hear about, from each of you, how you are thinking about digital identity or identities in your day job. Feel free to brag about all the cool stuff you're working on, and talk about everything that might involve this.
If I brag what I'm working on, everybody would be bored because it's kind of very technical. I want to stay a little bit broader. What I find interesting, especially, it's actually in the domain which I chose to work in. I recently changed jobs. It's this is super interesting. And digital identity is one thing. Digital identities should, in my opinion, be two things. They should be short-lived. Whether a digital identity from a passport, your passport is valid for 8 years, it's quite long. If your passport gets scanned by something and something got your passport number, it's valid for 8 years. We should shorten that, and we should shorten that using technology. Maybe a digital ID that rotates. When we're talking about computer-to-computer communication, we are talking these days not in years, not in months, but in hours, which is what we should do. Shorter-lived secrets, shorter-lived keys. And the second biggest problem is, and is both a problem in personal identity as in digital identity, is attestation. Who do you issue this identity to, and how can you verify it's actually them? There are very good examples of people you mentioned the Swiss one. I have one of those passports, they're amazing. You can get them, but you have to prove with your passport that you are you, and they will look at you very clearly and check this. That's the point of attestation. On the other hand, I have a plushie shark, and my plushie shark has a public transport card with a valid subscription for the Netherlands. I don't think that the shark should be allowed to have ownership of a Dutch governmental issued kind of ID. It's more of a case to describe this wrong as an attestation. I got one. But that's another interesting domain, and both of these fields we are currently investing a lot in the whole broad identity space.
Can I ask, I get it, I'm the panelist, so I get to ask as many follow-up questions as I want. How do you accomplish that kind of rotation without a central authority doing, verification? Like some kind of check-in system that says, okay, you still have access to this thing.
You cannot avoid some kind of decentralization.
Okay.
You have to define a root of trust.
Yeah. Okay.
You define who is your root of trust. Is it the government? Is it the private company? Is it your own home server?
Yeah, agreed. Q, what are you working on? Brag away.
I guess what I would say is the key takeaway I'd like people to have about data identity and digital identity is consider carefully the model of identity you need for your service and how much identity you actually need. Do you just need someone to log into a website to do something once a month? Then you probably don't even need to know their name. You can just I don't know, have send a link to someone's email and log in through that.
Yeah.
And as Maartje was saying, avoid long-term identity keys. Yeah. At least long-term shared identity keys. So passwords generally to be avoided if possible. I'm sure there are plenty of legacy systems that still require password-based authentication. But if you're building a new system, maybe consider don't have passwords.
Yeah.
And do you need to know someone's name? Do you need their phone number? Do you need a picture of their ID? Think about what's the minimal amount of identity you can ask for from someone to achieve what you need to do.
Yep, agreed. Jack, would you like to?
So I've been looking at research regarding subject access requests and what data is being held on you by organizations at the moment. Just off the back of some things that have come out recently with, several companies doing, a wrapped version of your summary of the last year's worth of usage of their organizations. You look at the likes of supermarkets giving you a quirky little summary of, oh, here was your most popular meal deal in the last year. Okay, so that's one summary of the data that they have on me. What else do they have on me? What are they inferring or predicting off the back of that? We've seen, well, I think it's like a decade-old article now, but there were supermarkets over in the US that were able to predict when customers were pregnant before they even knew, which I find is pretty scary. So yeah, I've been looking into a lot more as to like what data is being held and then what's being done with it. So yeah, I would encourage people to be mindful of that, and would like to see maybe kind of more transparent audit systems as to like what organizations are doing with your data when you hand it over to them.
Very cool. Otherwise I'm just going to ask everything. So yes, please go ahead.
Hi. First of all, love the plushy shark. Secondly, as a dual national, I have two officially designated citizenship identities, and that's only two of the identities that I think I hold. So I am missing from this conversation about the acknowledgement that people have multiple identities that they want to assert in different contexts, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks about that and what good examples they've seen of people being able to use multiple identities and, importantly, not having that information spill over from one identity context to another identity context.
Great question. Should we all have an infinite identities depending on who we're talking to?
Yes, actually. If you don't need, you may need to know something to identify me as me, but you don't need to know the same thing that someone else knows to identify me. This comes back to what I was saying about what's the minimal amount of data you need for your identity system. It doesn't necessarily need to be linkable to a legal physical person. And there are plenty of cases, and I guess this is getting into the slightly grim side of the news happening in the US, where you want to be able to show different identities of yourself to different parties, maybe lie about your identity to some parties who are asking too much. And perhaps we should be considering more about, does this identity system let you lie plausibly about your identity if you don't want someone to know it?
I'm thinking of this, due to a bug, I exist twice in the legal system of Belgium. I still get my taxation twice. Fantastic. I don't pay twice. And it comes back to what you were saying, like, why would you want to combine them? Like, you need to attest to one party that you're this person to this party and this person to this party. In very few cases, they would need to know both. And this applies to way further. I'm thinking currently towards, we are seeing a big problem with giant technology companies quickly changing their policies about everything, and all our social media depends on it. Like, should we have a movable identity which we can take from Facebook and move to a decentralized network? And things like ActivityPub already have like these portable identities. And we also might want to just be able to erase the identity and say, okay, we no longer want to be associated with this. And you might have multiple identities and just being like, okay, this party can only know my name. This party and this party may know everything because they're the government. They have to. We should really try to silo our identities towards where we're using them.
Totally agree with that, and I'm thinking of it from like a work and personal context as well. Obviously I work for the NHS, but then I'll also engage with the NHS as an employee does that mean I should have the same login to access my patient records, versus actually working in a day job? No. Does that mean that my colleagues should be able to access both, information about me in a work context and in a patient context? No. So I think it kind of all just comes down to context and, like you say, siloing appropriately based on that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. I don't know who was first. Sorry. I wasn't paying attention.
Thanks, Terence. So Dan already asked the question that I had, so I've come up with another one, which is the opposite. So I think we've established here that it makes sense to allow a single person to have multiple identities, and in fact that is a very good thing. Yeah. But is it therefore not acceptable to have a single identity that represents more than one person? And if that is in fact not a good idea, then what other constraints do we impose on the definition of digital identity that make it easier for us to achieve? So, we've talked a lot about stuff that, all of the flexibility and benefits and privacy and security, things that we want to see in digital identity. What constraints are we putting on the problem in order to make it easier to solve?
Got it. Can I ask a follow-up question? So, like, would an example be, I don't know, my neighborhood as an identity or something like that? Is that roughly?
Yeah, I'm thinking So I'm thinking like in a non-government context, for example. I mean, this doesn't make sense to kind of hide multiple citizens behind one social security number.
Got it.
But potentially you could have like one supermarket loyalty card that is like used by multiple people.
Got it.
So something like that.
Fair enough.
Sorry to get super technical. This is something the ITU, International Telephone Union, has been thinking about in the 1980s when they defined the X standards. And they wrote these things, what should be in a digital identity? And they came up with a common name. They came up with organizational unit, a street address, a state. And they came up with a lot of things because they were building a telephone book. That's what don't forget, our current security standards of the internet are based on a telephone book system. They already have this idea, and they have the idea like, yeah, you can have a certificate for your whole organizational unit, which you could identify that, hey, I am from the marketing department. Yes. The problem is that you will probably not want to share the same cryptographic material. So you would have to mint multiple identities with the same identity, so representing the same identity, which has been attested, like the government says, okay, you live on that street, so your passport contains, your identity contains this street, so you can log into your neighborhood watch system, for example. It already has use cases, and encoding multiple access levels in one identity is a solution, which you can then, once you have cryptographically verified that you are you, or with any login, I'm thinking passports here because that's just why we've been talking about the past half an hour. You can just verify, okay, you live on that street, you get access to this, it's come to your point of authorization, and yeah, you can represent multiple people, or you can like filter on a certain field.
Yeah, I think an identity representing a group of people is generally something that's quite desired and something that's needed quite often. Like in the context of work, it might be the group of people who are allowed admin access on this machine. Or in the context of business, it might be the group of people allowed to represent this company. Or it might, as you said, with the supermarket loyalty thing, it might be the group of friends that pool all their vouchers for the supermarket. But the difficulty comes with this in digital identity is that with the supermarket loyalty scheme, if you have this loyalty card, then you physically hand this around and you know there's one copy of it. You can't do that with data. To transfer data is to make a copy of it. So you have to be careful on a technical level of how your identity scheme is designed to make sure that the private material or whatever's being used to assert this identity isn't copied too widely. Otherwise, you might not be able to kick someone out of the group, which is generally also a desirable feature.
Yeah, I guess you've kind of got to think about it from a granularity point of view as well, that, if you're sharing personal data that could be identifiable about yourself, you want to consider, at what level, you want to share that, whether it's going to be, at, direct address level for, say, you're getting something sent to you versus, like, if you're filling out a survey and they just kind of want to know what street you live in or your postcode area, it kind of maybe comes down to, like, attribute-based kind of granularity for consenting to that.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. By the way, you should all go. We think about these aggregation. There's a case study from AOL, like I want to say 15, 20 years ago, where they released just query logs. If you haven't seen it, just query logs, and they were able to identify people. Like there was nothing PII in there, and like it was insane. We have 5 minutes left, so last question.
How do we avoid embedding cultural norms into some of these things? So I'm thinking like in parts of the Nordics, you can go and look up anyone's tax information and I can see how much you pay. But, you know, in the UK that, you know, sort of instinctively makes people's skin crawl. I'm sure there are places, you know, in the future where it would just be normal to have your medical records open for anyone to see, because why hide? I mean, I remember when I was growing up, you know, if you weren't straight, you know, it was something to keep very secret, and nowadays, for lots of people, it isn't. And so I just wonder, how do we keep from lots of these sort of technical discussions about PII and making sure things are segregated, they embed a very Western, sometimes quite American cultural norm, which A, might not fit our current society, but doesn't necessarily fit the future society.
To answer your question in a very sad way, technology is built by people, people represent cultures. If we were all be robots, we would have no culture. We were not robots, sadly and happily. It's impossible to not put bias into technology. What we are currently seeing with machine learning, there is bias in it because we are biased. And we are biased people, we have cultures, we have norms, and we build those into our technologies. It's going to be very hard to separate those. When we do build these systems, we might have to think not about the norm, but about the exception. For example, when you're talking about, yeah, people can be openly gay. In the US right now, maybe. That might change, and that's also for the rest of the world. When actually we as technologists should think about the worst case scenario. We're always proposing these, what if we do this solution, and what if we do this, what if we do this? But think about it, what if we have the current technology in a society which we have trust in other people? What if we run this in a society where you cannot trust other people? And as technologists, I think we should, when we design these systems, we have a lot more to say than we think. We can move this world forward by building or not building these technologies. And we should hold ourselves a little bit accountable for what in the worst case scenario. What if our government turns into an autocratic regime? How would this affect us?
To add to that, I think, so I'm British, I now live in Germany, so if I were to design a system, it would probably have quite a lot of British values and a few German values in it. But I have to be aware of that. So if I'm designing a system that I intend everyone to use, then I need to know, okay, I need to invite people from different cultures into this. And we need to have a proper sit down and discuss, what are we actually trying to achieve here? And what constraints are we putting on what this system is even trying to do? And we should come back to that. Maybe every 6 months, maybe every year, whatever. But we should come back to it regularly and say, have our assumptions about the world that went into designing this system changed? And when we're designing a system in the first place, we should design a system such that it can be changed in future if the society that made the system changes.
Yeah, cultural kind of norms are, never going to be the same tomorrow, for example. So yeah, you've got to think about it from a point of view of adaptability and portability, which are, great data principles in the first place. So yeah, I would think about it from that point of view, of trying to make it as flexible as possible going forward. Have a plan from the beginning, but plans don't always go to plan, so you may have to adapt.
Well, I mean, that's a terrific summary. I fully agree with that. I think the only thing that is absolutely guaranteed is change. And so just make sure your systems can respond to change. That is basically it. Trying to put the brakes on everything will never work. Anyhow, with that, we are out of time. Thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.